The Lander Field office of the Fish and Wildlife Service smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and the sharp metallic tang of gun cleaner. It was a scent Samuel Haskins had long ago stopped noticing. He sat at his cluttered metal desk, the gray morning light filtering through the grimy window, and mechanically filled out the final lines of an incident report. Ursus americanus, another black bear, had gotten into the trash receptacles of a wealthy subdivision in the foothills. No harm done, just a frightened homeowner and a mess for the county to clean up. It was the kind of tedious bureaucratic task that now constituted the bulk of his work, a slow erosion of the passion that had once driven him into this career. He pushed the form into a wire basket already overflowing with similar reports. Each one was a small paper tombstone marking the death of another piece of the wild, or another piece of him. The phone on his desk buzzed, a harsh, insistent sound that cut through the quiet. He picked it up. "Haskins." "Samuel, it's Henderson." The voice of his regional supervisor was thin and reedy, the sound of a man who lived by spreadsheets and died by complaint calls. "Got a situation for you. Sublette County, out near a settlement called Lost Creek. Multiple livestock depredations. Sheriff's out of his depth." Samuel leaned back in his chair, the springs groaning in protest. Lost Creek. The name itself sounded like a place you went to disappear. He pictured a map of Wyoming in his head, a vast, empty space with a few lonely dots. Lost Creek was one of the loneliest. "What's the predator?" "That's the thing," Henderson said, a rustle of paper on the other end. "Sheriff's report is colorful." He cleared his throat and read in a monotone. "Predator of anomalous size. Tracks inconsistent with known local fauna. Claws described as unnatural, almost hook-like. And my personal favorite, one rancher witnessed a lupine creature moving bipedally." A humorless smile touched Samuel's lips. He pictured it perfectly. A terrified farmer, a fifth of cheap whiskey, and a perfectly normal gray wolf whose size grew with every retelling of the story. Bipedal. Right. "So you're sending me on a 2-hour drive into the middle of nowhere for a tall tale." "I'm sending you because the complaint was elevated to the state senator's office," Henderson corrected, his voice losing its last trace of collegiality. "The ranchers out there are talking about forming a posse. We need this handled quietly and by the book before we have a bunch of yahoos with deer rifles shooting at shadows. Document it, tag it, and if necessary, put it down. File the report. You know the drill." The line went dead. Samuel stared at the phone for a long moment. Another headache. Lost Creek meant cold nights in his truck, placating panicked locals and tracking down an animal that was only doing what nature programmed it to do: survive. He felt a familiar bitter resentment rise in his chest. This job, once a calling, had become a prison of paperwork and politics. He drove home to the small, rented apartment that served as little more than a place to store his gear and sleep. The process of preparing for the field was the only thing that still brought him a measure of satisfaction, a sense of control in a life that felt increasingly adrift. He laid a canvas cloth on his kitchen table and began the ritual. His R700 rifle was stripped, cleaned, and oiled with practiced efficiency, each part moving under his hands with a familiar, reassuring click. The bolt slid home with a sound as final as a closing door. He checked the 0 on the LVX-5 scope, his fingers tracing its cold, hard lines. His Glock sidearm was holstered on his belt, carrying enough stopping power for anything on 4 legs in North America. Into a heavy-duty Pelican case went the rest of his kit: V binoculars, a laser rangefinder, a global positioning system unit, a genetic material sample kit, 3 BDS 4K trail cameras, a trauma kit, and the Iridium satellite phone. Each item had a purpose. Each piece was an answer to a question the wilderness might ask. As he packed, his gaze fell on a framed photograph on his nightstand. It was him and his daughter Emily, taken several years ago on a camping trip. She was smiling, a gap-toothed grin full of a light that now seemed impossibly distant. He remembered with a jolt that her 18th birthday had been last week. He'd been on a call, tracking a mountain lion. He'd missed it. He picked up his phone, typed out "Happy belated birthday, Em." "Sorry I missed it," then stared at the words. They felt hollow, inadequate. A band-aid on a broken bone. He deleted the message, the chasm between them too wide to be bridged by a text. He tossed the gear bag onto the passenger seat of his government-issue Ford F-150 and pulled out of Lander. The town gave way to open plains, then to the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the high country. On the horizon, the Wind River Range stood like a set of stone fangs, ready to devour the setting sun. The feeling of isolation grew with every passing mile, a weight pressing down on the roof of the truck. Samuel arrived in Lost Creek well after dark. The settlement was less a town and more a stubborn refusal to surrender to the vast emptiness surrounding it. A single-pump gas station, the cozy Pine Motel with a flickering neon sign where the sea had given up, and a bar named The Last Chance constituted the entire commercial district. The air was cold, thin, and smelled of wood smoke from the chimneys of the few scattered houses. A profound silence pressed in on him, the kind that felt heavier than noise. It was the silence of a place that had nothing left to say. He found the sheriff's office easily. It was a small addition built onto the side of a modest clapboard house. Sheriff Brody, a man in his 60s with a body gone to seed and a face like a worn leather glove, greeted Samuel with an air of weary resignation. He wasn't relieved to see Samuel, just resigned to the fact that his problem had become someone else's. He slid a thin manila folder across his desk. It contained a few typed statements and several blurry, out-of-focus photographs of tracks. "Happened 3 times now," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "First a couple of sheep, then last night, one of Old Man Cole's cows." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "The thing that gets me is that it doesn't eat them, Mr. Haskins. It disassembles them, like a kid pulling the wings off a fly." Brody was frightened, Samuel realized, but he was burying it deep beneath a lifetime of rural stoicism. The fear wasn't in his words, but in the way his eyes kept darting toward the dark window, expecting something to be looking back. Samuel studied the photos. The tracks were indeed huge, the impression in the mud far larger than any wolf he'd ever tracked. He took a room at the Cozy Pine. A nervous woman named Martha, the proprietor, her face a road map of worry lines, tried to pump him for information as she handed him a key. "You hear about the trouble?" He deflected with non-committal answers. The room was Spartan, a bed with a sagging mattress, a buzzing cathode ray tube television that showed only static, and the persistent smell of damp and pine-scented cleaner. He spread his map of the county on the small table, marking the locations of the attacks with a red pen. They formed a rough circle, a 5-mile radius with Lost Creek at its dead center. The predator was staying close. It had a territory, and they were in it. To get a feel for the local pulse, he walked over to the Last Chance bar. The interior was dim, paneled in dark wood scarred with the names of people long gone. 3 men sat at the bar, the bartender, an elderly rancher nursing a beer, and a silent, broad-shouldered logger. The low murmur of conversation ceased the moment he walked in. Every eye was on him, cold and assessing. He was an outsider, a government man, a problem in a different uniform. He ordered a Coors and took a seat at the end of the bar, content to listen. The talk, when it resumed, was all about the beast. Fear was the main ingredient, but it was mixed with a kind of grim country fatalism. These were people accustomed to hardship, but this was something new, something that felt personal and malevolent. This thing wasn't just killing for food. It was killing for sport. Back in his room, Samuel processed the information. The attacks were nocturnal, sporadic, and showed no fear of human proximity. This was not typical behavior, not even for a desperate or habituated grizzly. A normal predator establishes a pattern, a circuit. This thing struck at random, driven by something other than hunger. The illogical nature of it all gnawed at him. He decided his first move in the morning would be to visit the site of the latest attack, the coal ranch. Sleep didn't come easy. He dreamed of Emily. She stood at the far end of a long, dark hallway just watching him, her face devoid of expression. He tried to call out to her, but no sound came out. He woke with a start, his heart pounding. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, a lonely, mournful sound like something weeping in the darkness. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. He was the expert, the man they sent to solve the unsolvable. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sliver of doubt, a cold premonition that the rules he lived by did not apply here. The morning air was crisp and painfully bright. Samuel drove his truck down a rutted dirt road to the coal ranch. The owner, a wizened old man with trembling hands and eyes clouded with cataracts and fear, led Samuel toward the pasture without a word. The scent hit them 50 yards out. The coppery smell of blood and the gut-wrenching odor of viscera, sharp on the cold air. It clung to the back of the throat. On the frosted ground lay the remains of a Hereford cow. Samuel had seen hundreds of predator kills in his 25-year career. He'd seen what wolves, mountain lions, and bears could do. This was none of those. He crouched, his professional detachment a thin shield against the sheer wrongness of the scene. The animal's sternum hadn't been crushed or bitten through. It had been shattered inward by a force like a battering ram. The bone was splintered, driven into the chest cavity. Great, ragged chunks of flesh were torn away, not neatly sliced by incisors, but ripped out. The edges of the wounds were shredded, gouged by something that acted like hooks, not teeth. There were no telltale suffocation marks on the throat, no paired canine punctures. This was an act of extreme, explosive violence, not a hunt. It was an act of rage. Samuel stood and began his systematic search, walking in an ever-widening spiral from the carcass, his eyes scanning every inch of the ground. His boots left dark prints in the white frost. He found the tracks near a break in the wooden fence. They were immense, nearly twice the size of a large gray wolf's print, pressed deep into the frozen earth, indicating a creature of significant weight. The claws had dug in deep, leaving 5 distinct slash marks at the front of each pad. He followed the trail, his boots crunching on the stiff grass. And then he stopped. A cold sweat prickled the back of his neck. The logic of the scene fractured. Every single track led away from the cow, heading toward the dense pine forest that bordered the ranch. He spent the next hour making a full circuit of the pasture, his search pattern meticulous, his path a perfect grid. He examined the perimeter fence, the gate, the dirt road. There was no other trail. Not a single track led from the woods to the kill. It was a physical impossibility. A predator doesn't just materialize in the middle of a field. He examined the fence again. 2 thick wooden planks were snapped, the break pointing outward, consistent with a large animal forcing its way out. But there were no snagged tufts of hair, no scraps of hide caught on the splintered wood. An animal that size in a hurry would have left something behind. A bear would leave coarse fur. A wolf would leave finer guard hairs. This left nothing. His mind, trained to see patterns and follow cause and effect, slammed against a wall of pure illogic. A creature cannot be dropped from the sky. It cannot phase through solid matter. He worked backward, forcing himself to follow the evidence, no matter how insane the conclusion. The tracks led out, but not in. The only way that could happen, the only variable that could change, was the creature itself. It must have arrived as something else. Something that left the faint, unremarkable boot prints of a man. The thought was so alien, so contrary to his entire worldview, that he almost dismissed it. But the evidence was immutable. A man walked into this field, and this thing walked out. Despite the escalating absurdity, Samuel fell back on his training. Protocol was a rock in a sea of madness. He knelt by the carcass, pulling on a pair of latex gloves. He took swabs from the edges of the wounds for saliva analysis, though he doubted he'd find any. This was not a feeding. He found a single, coarse black hair snagged on a splinter of the cow's rib and carefully placed it in an evidence baggie. It was too thick for a wolf, too fine for a bear. He took dozens of photographs, documenting the scene from every angle, always with a ruler placed beside the tracks and wounds for scale. The pictures would show the facts, but they could not capture the wrongness. He sat in the cab of his truck for a long time, the engine off, trying to force the pieces together. His cynicism had been a comfortable cloak, but it had just been torn away. This was not a problem wolf. This was not some exaggerated tale from a drunken rancher. This was something that defied the fundamental laws of his world. He was a man who believed in cause and effect, in the predictable patterns of the natural world. What he had just witnessed had no logical cause. A chilling thought, cold and sharp as an icicle, pierced his professional calm. He was hunting something that was not supposed to exist. Passive observation was not going to work. Samuel knew he could not walk into Henderson's office and report that a ghost had torn apart a cow. He needed proof, something concrete and irrefutable that he could send up the chain of command. He needed a picture. There was only one way to get it. He had to capture an image of the creature. As dusk began to settle over the valley, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, he returned to the Cole ranch. Old Man Cole had given him permission with a weary wave of his hand, too broken to care anymore. Samuel worked quickly and efficiently, his movements economical, honed by years of field work. He set up his 3 trail cameras, their silent, infrared eyes his only hope. The first was positioned with a clear view of the cow's remains, which now served as a massive, grisly bait station. The second he aimed directly at the break in the fence, the creature's only known exit point. He aligned it perfectly, framing the snapped boards like a doorway. The third, and most critical, he mounted on a pine tree 100 yards away, focused on the single game trail that led from the pasture deep into the black maw of the forest, the path the tracks had taken. He was not going to leave. Trusting technology was one thing. Being present was another. He drove his Ford F-150 to a low rise that overlooked the ranch and a swath of the adjoining woods, giving him a perfect vantage point. He killed the engine and the lights, sinking the world into near-total darkness. The cab of the truck became a cold steel box. From a hard case, he retrieved his PT-2 thermal scope and mounted it on his Remington. He poured a cup of coffee from his thermos, the steam ghosting in the frigid air, and settled in for a long, cold vigil. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through his insulated clothing, making his muscles ache. Through the thermal scope, the world was a shifting landscape of grayscale heat signatures. He watched a trio of deer pick their way cautiously across a distant meadow, their bodies glowing white against the cool black of the ground. A lone coyote, a fleeting gray wisp, trotted along the tree line. It paused, sniffed the air in the direction of the carcass, and then bolted as if it had smelled death itself. Nothing unusual. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sighing of the wind in the pines. The ranch below remained still and lifeless. A part of him was deeply disappointed. Another, smaller part was profoundly relieved. Just before dawn, stiff and exhausted, he drove down from the hill. He collected the cameras, his fingers numb from the cold. Back in the relative warmth of his truck, he pulled out his laptop. He inserted the first secure digital card, the one from the camera on the bait. He scrolled through hundreds of images, magpies, a fox, the coyote. Nothing. He put in the second card, from the camera on the fence, also empty. His heart sank with a familiar, weary frustration. He was chasing a ghost after all. With a sigh, he slid the third and final card into the slot, the one from the camera on the forest trail. The screen populated with thumbnails. He clicked on a video file, time-stamped 2:17 anti-meridium. The grainy, monochrome footage began. For a few seconds, nothing. Then, movement. A figure emerged from the dense woods, stepping onto the trail. It was not an animal. It was tall, stooped, and it moved on two legs, but its gait was a horrifying, jerky parody of a human walk. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and its body was covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. It paused in the center of the frame, turning its head as if sniffing the air. In the invisible wash of the camera's infrared illuminator, two eyes flashed with a cold, bright light. Then it looked toward the camera, and Samuel's blood turned to ice. It did not have the muzzle of a wolf or a bear. It had a face, distorted, elongated, but unmistakably, horribly human, its features twisted into a permanent rictus of agony or rage. The creature stood for a moment longer, then it lurched forward, breaking into an unnervingly fast, shambling run, and disappeared back into the trees. Samuel stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. He played the video again, and again. The pragmatist, the cynic, the man of science, was looking at undeniable proof of a monster from a fever dream. The cold he'd felt all night was nothing compared to the glacial dread spreading from the pit of his stomach. The shock subsided, replaced by the cold, desperate clarity of a cornered man. Samuel forced his mind to work, to impose logic on the illogical. He listed the facts, stark and unassailable, in his head. Fact 1. The tracks only led away from the kill site. It materialized from nothing. Fact 2. The trail cameras proved the creature was not at the ranch during the night. The bait was untouched, the fence uncrossed. Fact 3. The video showed it leaving the area and it had a human face. A twisted, broken, but human face. Fact 4. It had ignored the bait, the easy meal. It was not hunting for food. He followed the chain of reasoning to its only possible monstrous conclusion. The creature had already been on the ranch before nightfall. It had been there in a different form. A human form. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He was not hunting an animal. He was hunting a person who became that animal. But then a new, chilling inconsistency emerged. If the creature was already on the ranch, why did the trail camera capture it coming out of the forest and heading away? It made no sense. He played the video again, watching the thing pause, look around, and then run off. It was a performance. It knew the camera was there. It was deliberately creating a false narrative, a breadcrumb trail leading away from the truth. It wanted to be seen leaving the area to establish a false timeline, to make anyone who found this footage believe the creature was a denizen of the deep woods. This wasn't just a predator. It was intelligent, cunning, and manipulative. The word werewolf echoed in the silent cab of his truck, a word from folklore and fantasy that suddenly felt terrifyingly real. But he immediately discarded the supernatural trappings. This was not magic. It was biology. An unknown species, a mimetic predator, a form of parasitic transformation, a disease. The mechanism did not matter. The result was the same. The impossible tracks leading away from the kill suddenly made perfect, horrible sense. A man walked into the pasture. Something happened. And a monster walked out. Hunting this thing at night, in the forest on its own turf, was suicide. He had seen how fast it moved. It was a blur of unnatural motion. He would be the prey. The only way to win was to change the game. He had to find it during the day, when it was wearing its human shell, when it was vulnerable. The hunt had just become a homicide investigation. He had to identify the monster living among the handful of souls in Lost Creek. He knew instantly he could not show the video to anyone. Not Henderson, not Brody. They would think he was insane. They would pull him from the case, order a psychiatric evaluation, and the creature would remain free, aware that it was being hunted. He was utterly terrifyingly alone with this secret. This knowledge was a poison that only he had to drink. He dragged the video file to the trash bin on his laptop, then securely erased it. The only copy was on a micro-secure digital card, now encrypted and tucked into a hidden seam inside his jacket. It was his proof, but also his death warrant. He began a new process, not as a wildlife officer, but as a profiler. The population of Lost Creek was less than 30 people. He started a list on a notepad, writing down every name he'd heard. Sheriff Brody, Old Man Cole, Jed, the logger he'd seen at the bar, Martha, the motel owner, the bartender, and one more name he'd overheard someone mention, Dr. Alan Reed, a recluse who lived on the outskirts of the settlement. He needed a profile. The host had to be physically strong, capable of withstanding the transformation. The violence at the Cole Ranch spoke of immense power. They would be an outsider, someone living in self-imposed isolation. They had a traumatic past, a reason to flee the wider world and hide in a place like Lost Creek. They would be someone hiding a terrible, all-consuming secret. He looked at his list. Brody was getting on in years, his physical condition poor. Cole was ancient. Jed the logger was a strong, solitary man. But the name that snagged in his mind was Dr. Reed. A doctor, a man of science, someone with medical knowledge who understood his condition and was trying to manage or conceal it, someone who had chosen isolation after a tragedy. The profile fit almost too perfectly, a narrative so neat it felt constructed. Samuel's mind, the part of him that still clung to reason, rebelled against the simplicity. It was the kind of solution one found in a cheap novel, not in the messy reality of life. He felt a deep-seated need for this to be wrong, for there to be a more rational explanation. But every other lead was a dead end, and the evidence, circumstantial as it was, pointed in only one direction. His professional instincts were at war with the sheer theatricality of the scenario. He circled the name. He had to start somewhere. His first target for observation would be the reclusive doctor. The hunt for a man had begun. Samuel drove to a wooded area a few miles from the logger's cabin, parking his truck out of sight. He approached on foot, moving with the quiet patience he usually reserved for tracking elk. The forest floor was a soft carpet of pine needles, muffling his steps. From a concealed position on a ridge overlooking the small, ramshackle dwelling, he watched Jed for hours through his binoculars. The man's life was a simple, laborious routine. He split firewood with a heavy maul, his movements powerful but economical, each swing a study in controlled force. He painstakingly cleaned and repaired the chain on his massive chainsaw, his scarred hands surprisingly delicate with the small file. He ate cold beans directly from a can, sitting on his porch steps, staring out at the trees with a blankness that spoke of profound exhaustion, not malice. Samuel watched him closely, looking for any sign of aberration, any hint of the coiled violence he'd seen at the Cole Ranch. He saw nothing but a man weary of the world, seeking solace in physical labor and solitude. After circling the cabin discreetly and finding no suspicious tracks or a heavily fortified shed, Samuel crossed Jed off his mental list. The logger was hiding from something, but it was the past. He needed more information on the doctor. He drove back to the motel, feigning an issue with the hot water in his room to engage Martha in conversation. The proprietor, starved for new gossip, was an open book. "Oh, Dr. Reed?" she said, her eyes lighting up as she fiddled with a fuse box. "Such a strange man. Moved here about 2 years ago all the way from Denver. Keeps to himself. The story goes his wife died back there. Some kind of accident, very tragic. He bought the old Halloway place up on the hill. Never has any visitors. He gets deliveries, medical stuff, but he never lets the driver pass the porch. A doctor from a major city, a dead wife, a sudden move to total isolation. The puzzle pieces were clicking into place with an unnerving neatness. To cover his bases, Samuel stopped by the sheriff's office to give Brody a token progress report, mostly vague assurances that he was closing in on a large, aggressive wolf. He used the visit to observe Brody more closely. The sheriff was simply an old, tired man, overwhelmed by a situation he could not comprehend. His fear was genuine, his involvement impossible. His physique, soft and stooped, could not account for the brute force needed to shatter a cow's sternum. The focus now narrowed entirely to Dr. Reed. Samuel found the house easily. A large 2-story Victorian home perched on a hill, set back from the main road. It was well maintained, but had a somber, brooding presence against the stark landscape, like a man in a black suit at a wedding. He found another observation point, a thicket of aspens on an adjacent slope, and settled in for another long watch. This was his element. The patient, methodical observation of a target. The waiting. The world was solved by waiting and watching. He watched the house for 2 full days, subsisting on protein bars and water from his pack. A pattern quickly emerged. Dr. Reed was a man of strict routine. Every other morning, at precisely 9 o'clock ante-meridiem, he would leave in his dark blue sedan and drive east toward the larger town of Pinedale. He was usually gone for at least 3 hours. Samuel surmised he was picking up medical supplies or groceries, things unavailable in Lost Creek. This predictable absence was the opportunity Samuel needed. He felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. What he was contemplating, breaking and entering a private residence, was a felony. It went against every rule and regulation he had sworn to uphold. It was a line he had never crossed, but the image of that mangled cow, the memory of the creature's human-like face on the video, burned in his mind. The rules were written for a world that made sense. This was no longer that world. He could not risk another attack, another life. He had to know what was inside that house. He made his decision. The next time Dr. Reed's sedan pulled onto the highway, Samuel would be going in. His moral compass was spinning, broken by the weight of an impossible choice. On the 3rd morning of his surveillance, Dr. Reed's blue sedan pulled out of the driveway at 9:01 ante-meridiem, punctual as a train. Samuel gave him a 10-minute head start, then moved. He left his truck hidden and approached the house from the rear, using the cover of a line of tall pine trees. The back door was a simple affair with an old pin tumbler lock. Samuel pulled a small leather case from his jacket pocket. Inside was a compact set of lock picks, a skill he'd acquired in a misspent youth and hadn't used in 30 years. His hands were steady, but a cold self-loathing washed over him as the tumblers clicked one by one under the gentle pressure of the tension wrench. The lock sprang open with a soft snick. The sound was deafening. The inside of the house was immaculate, almost sterile. Polished wood floors, dust-free surfaces. The living room shelves were lined not with novels or trinkets, but with thick medical textbooks and journals. Anatomy, pathology, virology. There were no family photos, no personal touches. It was the home of a ghost, a man actively trying to erase himself. Samuel moved quickly and quietly through the ground floor and then the second. Bedrooms, a study filled with modern diagnostic equipment, a centrifuge, a microscope, an autoclave, a pristine kitchen. Nothing. No signs of struggle, no hidden journals, no secret compartments. Just the crushing, sterile emptiness. That left the basement. The door to it, tucked away in a small hallway, was immediately out of place. It was not the flimsy wooden door one would expect. This was a heavy, solid-core door, reinforced with sheets of steel bolted to the wood. 3 thick, industrial-grade slide bolts were mounted on the outside. A heavy-duty hasp for a padlock was there, but no lock was present. A door like this was not designed to keep people out. It was designed to keep something in. With a grunt of effort, Samuel slid back the heavy bolts. The screech of metal on metal was jarring in the silent house. He pulled the door open and was hit by a faint, layered smell. The sharp, clean scent of antiseptic overlaid with the coppery, foul odor of old blood and sweat. He drew his Glock, flicked on the weapon-mounted light, and descended the concrete steps. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a stark, empty chamber. The walls and floor were bare concrete. In the very center of the room, a heavy steel ring was bolted directly into the floor with thick anchor bolts. Attached to it was a length of thick, welded link chain, ending in a massive padded collar that looked like something from a medieval dungeon. The padding was torn and stained. The concrete floor and the lower parts of the walls were covered in deep scratches and gouges, as if something with incredible strength had clawed at them relentlessly. Dark, brownish stains were soaked into the porous concrete around the ring. Blood. Old blood. Every piece fell into place, forming a picture of horrifying clarity. Dr. Reed was the creature. He knew what he was. He had moved to this isolated place and built this containment cell to lock himself away during his transformations. The chains, the steel door, the bolts. It was a desperate scientific attempt at self-quarantine. But recently the beast had grown too strong. It had broken free. The cow at the Cole Ranch was the result of a containment failure. A wave of grim relief washed over Samuel, followed by a surge of dread. He had found his monster. Confronting Reed in his human form was too risky, the outcome unpredictable. The only logical course of action was to wait for the transformation and ambush the creature. He would treat it as he would any other dangerous animal. He pulled out his phone and checked the lunar calendar, a morbid curiosity compelling him. The screen glowed with the answer. Tonight was the full moon. The sheer cinematic cliché of it all was a sick joke played by a cruel and methodical universe. As twilight bled from the sky, Samuel returned to his observation post on the wooded hill. This time he was not just watching. He was preparing a kill zone. He was about 150 yards from the house, a comfortable distance for his R700. The position gave him a clear line of sight to the front of the house and the yard around it. He meticulously cleared a small patch of ground, removing twigs and dry leaves that might rustle at a critical moment. He laid down his insulated ground pad, a barrier against the frozen earth. He unrolled his camouflage shooting mat and set his rifle on its bipod, the weapon settling into a stable, solid position. The rifle felt like an extension of his own body. He double-checked his scope, confirming the 0 and making minute adjustments for distance and the almost non-existent wind. He twisted the sleek black cylinder of a suppressor onto the threaded barrel of his rifle. It would not make the shot silent, not with a high-powered round, but it would mask the muzzle flash and distort the sound, making it harder for the target to pinpoint his location if his first shot did not find its mark. He chambered a single high-powered round, the polished brass casing glinting in the dying light. The action was smooth, quiet, final. Lying on the cold earth, rifle at the ready, Samuel felt a familiar, hyper-focused calm settle over him. It was the same calm he felt when tracking a wounded bear or cornered mountain lion. But beneath it, a current of unease churned. He was not a murderer. Yet he had passed judgment on Dr. Reed. He justified it with cold logic. Once transformed, Reed was no longer a man. He was a biological threat, an animal of extreme danger that had to be put down. It was his job. He repeated the words to himself like a mantra, a shield against the moral weight of his decision. This was pest control, nothing more. The hours crawled by. A brilliant cold moon rose, bathing the clearing in front of the house in ethereal silvery light. It was so bright he did not need the thermal scope. A single light burned in a downstairs window. Through his scope, Samuel saw the silhouette of Dr. Reed pacing back and forth behind the curtain. The movements were agitated, frantic. A man walking to his own execution. Around 11 o'clock, the light in the house went out. Samuel tensed, his finger resting on the rifle's stock. He heard a faint, muffled thud from the direction of the house, then another. The sounds were of a body hitting a wall, a desperate internal struggle. Then a low, guttural moan that was more pain than rage. Silence. Samuel pictured the horrific fight taking place in that basement. The man versus the monster within. It was close to midnight when Samuel, beginning to think his lunar calculations were nothing more than superstitious nonsense, heard a sound that did not belong. It was not the screech of splintering wood or an inhuman roar. It was the familiar, mundane rumble of a truck engine. He shifted his aim from the house to the driveway, puzzled. He was not expecting visitors. He swept the scope across the property. Nobody else should be here. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees as a vehicle rounded the bend in the road. It pulled to a stop in front of the house. It was a government-issue Ford F-150, a late model, the same dark green as his own. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs. He zoomed in with his scope, trying to get a look at the driver as the door opened. A figure stepped out, illuminated by the cold, unforgiving light of the moon. The breath caught in his lungs, a knot of ice forming in his chest. The man walking toward Dr. Reed's front door was wearing his Carhartt jacket, his worn jeans. He had the same tired, purposeful gait. The man was him. Samuel was watching himself. Samuel remained frozen on the hill, his eye pressed to the scope, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. A perfect copy of him, the same build, the same salt and pepper hair, the same weary set to his shoulders, was walking calmly toward the house. This double did not hesitate. He moved with a sense of ownership, of belonging. He reached into his pocket, produced a key, and unlocked the front door as if he owned the place. Samuel reflexively patted his own jacket pocket. His keys were still there, cold and solid against his thigh. His mind raced, scrambling for a rational explanation. A copied key? A picked lock that he hadn't seen in the dark? Or was the creature such a master of observation that it had learned where a spare key was hidden? A detail he had no way of knowing. The impossibility of it was secondary to the chilling fact that it was inside. The double slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. The house swallowed him. A moment later, a scream tore through the night silence. It was a man's voice, Dr. Reed's, a raw, guttural cry of pure mortal terror. Not the sound of a man transforming, but the sound of a man seeing his executioner. The scream was cut short, ending in a wet, gurgling sound. A sound of finality. Then, nothing. An absolute ringing silence that was more terrifying than the scream itself. In that instant, Samuel's entire understanding of the situation shattered and reassembled itself into a new, far more hideous shape. The basement cell, the chains, the steel-reinforced door, they were not for keeping a monster in. They were for keeping a victim. Dr. Reed was never the werewolf. He was the larder. He had been a prisoner, and his jailer was a creature that wore his face. And now that same creature was wearing Samuel's. The whole investigation, his careful profiling, his logical deductions, all of it had been a lie, a script written by the thing he was hunting. It hadn't just led him to a conclusion. It had constructed the conclusion for him, using the basement as its most compelling piece of false evidence. A carefully staged scene designed to make him believe a simple gothic horror story, while the real, far more complex truth operated just beneath the surface. The front door of the house creaked open again. The figure of his double stood silhouetted in the doorway. In the moonlight, Samuel could see that the man's hands and forearms were dark, slick with fresh blood. The copy looked left, then right, scanning the dark tree line as if searching for witnesses. Then its head snapped around, its gaze locking directly onto the thicket where Samuel lay concealed. It knew. It had known he was there all along. The chill on the hill, the sense of being watched. It had not been his imagination. He was not the hunter. He was the next meal. And then, as Samuel watched in paralyzed horror, his double began to change. This was no shimmering special effect, no graceful transformation. It was a grotesque and violent biological upheaval. The skin on its face rippled and flowed like hot wax. Bones audibly snapped and reformed beneath the surface, elongating, distorting. The features of his own face, his tired eyes, the lines around his mouth, melted away, stretching into the bestial semi-humanoid snout he had seen on the trail camera footage. His Carhartt jacket and jeans tore as the thing's musculature bunched and expanded, its skeleton contorting into a new, monstrous framework that was neither man nor beast but a hellish fusion of both. The final, terrible revelation landed. This creature was not a man who turned into a beast. It was a perfect biological mimic. It did not transform. It shed its human camouflage like a snake sheds its skin. It had seen Samuel on his first day in Lost Creek, at the motel, in the bar, it did not matter. It had studied him, copied him. Dr. Reed had been its previous disguise and its captive food source. Now the real Samuel Haskins was a witness, a loose end that had to be eliminated, and the monster knew exactly where he was. The creature, its horrific metamorphosis complete, straightened to its full, towering height. It was a nightmare of long limbs, dark fur, and unnatural angles, standing 7 feet tall in the cold moonlight. It let out a low, guttural rumble, a sound that Samuel felt as a vibration in his chest more than he heard with his ears. It did not charge. It just stood there in the moonlight, its luminous eyes fixed on his position, a predator supremely confident in its power. This was not just a hunt. It was a duel. It was acknowledging him. It was savoring the moment before the kill. Samuel snapped his rifle up, the stock firm against his shoulder. His mind, now terrifyingly clear, raced. He was not just aiming at a monster. He was aiming at a thing that, in a few hours, would revert to its disguise. It would become Samuel Haskins again. It would get into his truck, using his keys and his credentials. It would drive back to Lander and file a perfect report. Problem wolf successfully identified and liquidated. Case closed. It would continue to live his life, drawing his salary, accessing his bank account until it moved to a new town with a new assignment, and found a new, secret victim to lock in a basement. The real Samuel's body would be found weeks or months from now, deep in the Wyoming wilderness. The cause of death would be listed as a bear mauling or an unfortunate hunting accident. The case would be closed. The creature wearing his face would walk free. In that moment, Samuel understood that this was no longer about his own survival. This was his duty. A duty that went far beyond his job description. He was the only person on earth who knew the truth, the only one standing between this thing and its next victim. The years of burnout, the cynicism, the weary resignation, it all burned away in a flash of pure, cold adrenaline. All that remained was the primal essence of his being, a hunter facing his quarry. A man defending not just his own life, but the lives of countless others who would follow. An image of his daughter's face, her real smiling face from the photograph, flashed in his mind. He pictured this thing, this mimic, trying to contact her, to use his memories against her. He could not, would not, let this thing ever get near her world. He settled the crosshairs of the loopholed scope. A body shot was too risky. He had no knowledge of this thing's internal anatomy. He'd seen what it did to the cow. It had to be the head. The central nervous system. A kill switch. He centered the reticle on the creature's head, a head that still held a nightmarish, distorted echo of his own features. It was like looking into a broken mirror. He took a slow, steadying breath, letting half of it out, just as he had been taught decades ago. The world narrowed to the circle of his scope. The wind was still. The moon was bright. His finger found the trigger. His hands were rock steady. In this moment of absolute crystalline focus, there were only three things in the universe: him, his rifle, and his target. To save the world from Samuel Haskins, he had to kill Samuel Haskins. He applied smooth, deliberate pressure,